Schröder is Senior Research Fellow in the Environment and Society Program at Chatham House, which is also known as Royal Institute of International Affairs. And he specialized in research on the global transition to an inclusive circular economy with a specific focus on collaborative opportunities between key countries, circular economy policy analysis, closing the investment gap, and building an evidence base for trade in a circular economy. Prior to joining Chatham House in 2018, Patrick was a research fellow at Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. He worked as a consultant for the EU, Asian Development Bank, UNEP, GIZ, and other multilateral organizations. Patrick holds a PhD in environmental studies from Victoria University of Wellington. In 2021, he started a new PhD research project on circular design solutions for digital technologies at the Center for Sustainable Design, UCA. So let's welcome Patrick, our first speaker.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to join this event today. Can you hear me okay, or do I need to take down the mask? No, you're all right? Okay, great, thanks. Is there a pointer? Or
no, we will be your pointer.
You'll be doing this, okay. So just as an introduction, so I work in the at the Environment and Society Program at Chatham House. So we're a policy international affairs think tank. And our program, Environment and Society Program, is now the largest group within Chatham House, which indicates that global sustainability, global environmental change issues are moving up right on the agenda alongside with other international issues. And so we're not directly involved in, let's say, very technical or models like this morning, but we try to work at the interface between research, evidence-based research and the policy. So we do a lot of engagement as well as convening, trying to bridge that gap often that we see between science and policy decision-making. And so the presentation today won't be a very technical model that I present. It's also not a finished paper, but it's a little bit introducing what we're doing, where we're coming from, and also maybe outlining what we see as a need for as a research agenda, trying to link the net zero strategies or net zero transition with the circular economy agenda, basically locating net zero transition into a wider resource agenda. And let's go to that one. So I'll just start with some of the previous publications that came up. So what we tried to do is to locate the circular economy in the international development context. And until a few years ago, circular economy was mainly discussed in the EU and China, which has very good policy frameworks and lots of experiences in eco-industrial park developments, some of these things. But across the world, the concept of circular economy wasn't very well known, and policymakers weren't very confident that this could be an alternative type of development pathway. So we engage a lot internationally on the circular economy agenda, and so these were some of the from this report that was published back then in 2019. So linking it to the topic of infrastructure development in particular, so one of the findings or one of the messages that we wanted to put out was that restructuring economies to accommodate more circular activities would require a major shift in infrastructure, industrial processes, and innovation priorities. And developing countries are already facing a major infrastructure investment gap in the order of $1 trillion a year between now and 2030. So the question is, how can we shift this investment towards circular infrastructure? The other area that we've been looking at is also the trade dimension. So really, a lot of countries in the global south, they're looking at the circular economy as an opportunity to also enhance trade. And so we are now also very much engaged with organizations like WTO, the Aid for Trade agenda, where we try to identify some of these opportunities. And especially for infrastructure development, the improved trading and secondary building materials between developed and developing countries could provide an important pathway to meeting those demands. That's what we came up with. Yeah. I can actually look at the screen here. It might be. That's right. And I don't need to turn around so much. I've noticed I've been used to Zoom so much now because you can just look at the screen. So this is a report we published last year where we tried to link the circular economy with the just transition agenda, because the just transition has been very prominent in discussions around low carbon transitions, but that link hasn't been made specifically now to the circular economy or to the wider resource agenda. So, for example, on the EU level, just transitions is mainly now discussed around, so what happens to regions and communities that heavily depend on coal. And I know that from the area in Germany where I am, there's a lot of lignite mining taking place. So with the coal phase out, there's questions around, okay, so what happens to these regions? And it's even more relevant for Eastern European countries like Poland, etc. So very recently at the COP, so just transitions was also included in the language that came out of the Glasgow Act. So it's a key concept. It links also actually to the previous presentation by Professor Madison, for instance, because we want to also, so it's about how to account for potential negative impacts of the energy transition so that communities are not negatively affected, either by new installations of renewables or changing of economic activities away from fossil fuels, etc. But it's, yeah, so we try to match this with the circular economy agenda, and these were some of the key messages here, that we also try to understand how countries which depend on certain what we call linear sectors would be potentially negatively impacted by a global transition away into a more circular model. So we also continue to highlight the need for enhanced global cooperation on these topics, and especially coordination on multilateral level, and that is also beginning to happen. Increasingly, you find UN organizations, UNDP, UNIDA, for instance, UNDP, OECD, WTO, they're looking at these issues and trying to think through multilateral solutions and approaches to that. Okay. And another area that we've tried to look at is actually how to finance a circular economy transition. And so that's something we published last year, where we try to analyze how much finance is actually going towards circular economy. And we've noticed there's increasing interest in circular economy finance, but there's still lots of issues as well. So the indicators, how to assess what is linear, what is circular, is still very fuzzy. And for many investors, circular economy is still considered high risk, so they tend to shy away from it. But we've seen that also some very large investment funds like BlackRock or Intesa Sanpaolo in Italy, their funds have grown from millions into billions already over the last few years. So there's quite some momentum here. And in the report, we also try to highlight again, there's the need for investments going into low and middle income countries. So at the moment, most of the investments are in Europe or Japan or China, the US. But there's again, so if there's this finance gap, again, there's linked to the SDG again, there's risk of the global south being left behind. So maybe to the next one. Yeah. So now with the global infrastructure, there just very recently there have been interesting announcements about new funds, not only in response to the pandemic. So there's the G20 governments announced 3.2 trillion in infrastructure stimulus. Then the IEA published a study regarding the low carbon energy infrastructure. So their estimate it will have to rise to 5 trillion by 2030 and then stay on that level until 2050 to reach net zero. So these are significant investments. Kind of like a smaller initiative that was announced by the UK government was the Clean Green Initiative during Glasgow. It's looking at 3 billion over the next few years to support green infrastructure and industrial development. And so one of the blind spots, in a way you could say, that we see there is that all of this is focused on CO2 mostly. So in a way it focuses on a few elements of the periodic table, but it doesn't account for a range of other issues. So it's not taking into account the issues from resource extraction, the use phase, and waste generation. And so what we're trying to start now is I mean, we would argue we need to build these new infrastructures, not just in a net zero way, but according to circularity principles. Otherwise, we're repeating, you could say, the same mistakes that we've done in the past, building something in a linear way rather than in a circular way. So these are the research questions that we're trying to look at. So what circularity principles and solutions need to be integrated into net zero infrastructure development and the built environment as part of that? And in reverse again, because that's an interesting relationship. So what types of infrastructure do we need to enable a circular economy? And then again, looking at the finance issue, so what are the necessary instruments and also the necessary metrics to evaluate infrastructure development. So that's something we're trying to understand. We haven't got the answers to that, but hopefully we will in a while. So the reason why this is important, and just as a picture, so this is from the US, I think in Wyoming, where wind farms were decommissioned, and actually there's no use for those blades. So you can see the size of the turbine blades at the end of life. So they were just being landfilled. That's a huge issue that hasn't really been considered in the development. And in 2018, last time I went to Beijing, I visited Goldwind at Jinfeng, who have one of their R&D centers in Yizhuang in Beijing. And basically one of their innovation managers said that the end-of-life issue of blades, that's the biggest headache that they have in terms of sustainability issues of the wind industry. And there's no good solution because they cannot be recycled easily. They're doing some research on alternative materials, but that's also still in the R&D phase. So we really need to think about this problem. And that's at the end of life. But then if we look at the kind of upstream, so this is a recent study by the IEA looking at the metals and minerals demands of the energy transition. And you see here on the left, on the left side. So the net zero scenario by 2050 will see 600% increase of various materials. So that's mainly from EV and battery storage, but also electricity networks. And so then on the right side, you see the different materials which are needed for that. Okay, next one. And so what we try to highlight is how actually these issues, both the ESG risks in resource extraction and mining, but also the other costs that come potentially down the line for developers in terms of EPR, extended producer responsibility, but also decommissioning and disposal costs. So these are financial risks for investors, and these haven't been priced into a lot of the kind of project development for renewables. So these are like externalized costs at the moment, and so these costs, in a way, are carried often by communities in the global south where mining takes place. So there's actually a recent documentary on Panorama about cobalt mining in the DRC and Tesla's problem. And then on the other end, this is probably a cost that taxpayers will need to basically pay for because they haven't been included yet. But we also wanted to show that through a circular approach, these risks can be mitigated. So if we design the energy value chain in a different way, so we can create new opportunities also for a range of other economic activities around these things through reuse and repair, changing electricity utilization patterns, which also means reduction in actual energy demand, to include life cycle costing in the project planning, recovery of materials. All of these things can be done and make the net zero transition a lot more sustainable in terms of materials and resources. So, this is something we're also trying to think through in some more detail. What would a circular economy look like for the mining sector? So there's lots of circular things that could be done, ranging from shared use infrastructure during the mining, but also a whole range of across the value chain, repair of electronics and reuse models, remanufacture, etc., etc. But each of these needs to be unpacked a lot more in detail what it actually means for which specific technology, for which specific country setting and industry. And, just an overview of the potential impact in terms of environment, society, and economy, the anticipated increase of mineral extraction in low and middle income countries. So already mining causes very, very significant impact on communities, but there's also huge labor issues. And I mean, the other large trend that we see, for instance, in corporate accountability is not only climate and environmental impact, but the whole due diligence on human rights. This is another trend. And in a way, in the upstream supply chain of lots of the minerals that you need for the energy transition, these issues converge. So that's also something that needs to be looked at. So now with the infrastructure, how do we build it accordingly to circular principles? We've been trying to understand what the potential benefits could be. So this is just a list of these, and there's probably more, but we again need to understand. We're trying to understand these in some more detail and how to implement them. So. Yeah, so this is in a way also an idea, because a lot of infrastructure, so there will be a lot of international finance necessary, but there's also the need to coordinate in a way between some of the large donors and kind of there's donor countries and recipient countries, US and EU, plus other G20 countries. And so what we need actually we need to mainstream these circular approaches across all of these agencies that are involved, including not only the multilateral development banks, but then also private finance. And so that net zero and the resource agenda are being not looked at separately, but integrated. And I think there's also good opportunity to engage more with China's Belt and Road, which is also massive in terms of infrastructure, probably the largest now globally. So, and with the research going forward, we're probably trying to collect case studies, and we'd be very interested to see if there are examples from the Belt and Road Initiative which have implemented infrastructure according to some circularity principles. Could be eco-industrial development parks, but it could also be something around improved waste management or remanufacturing facilities. There's also, again, lack of data on this. I wasn't able to find much. And I think, yeah, that's all from my side. So a lot of questions, unfortunately, not so many answers, but I think some work going forward, and we're happy to cooperate with UCL, other universities, and we're trying to build a bridge also to other actors in finance and in policy, etc. So we can maybe work together on these things.